Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for attending the fall meeting of the Bacteria Implementation Group. As this is a large group, and I want to be mindful of your time, we're going to go ahead and get started, and we'll catch folks up as we go along. I'm Stephen Johnston with the Houston-Galveston Area Council, facilitating this meeting on behalf of the Bacteria Implementation Group, and we will proceed through the slides. Couple of quick meeting tips and etiquette. So we should all be fairly familiar with most of these video platforms, conferencing platforms. Just for those not familiar with Zoom, or just for this meeting today, you're going to be allowed to mute and unmute yourself. Just be mindful of that, so that when you're not speaking, or if you're not presenting, to turn your cameras off. If you ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question. You can turn your video on as well. If you just introduce yourself and let folks know who you are, Zoom also track who you are as well. If you're not interested in muting and unmuting, or are concerned about it, you can certainly use the chat feature. Andrea Tantillo will be on this conference today, monitoring the chat feature for me, just in case I miss any comment or chat question that you might have. Certainly ask those, and I encourage questions throughout the presentation today. It'll help break up my talk and my speaking to you today. So feel free to do that as we go through this meeting today. For the agenda for us today, we will have a short introduction. It's going to focus on just those members of the BIG. Again, we're going to have a large group of about 50 or so folks that had registered for today's meeting, and don't really want to spend all the time going through everybody in terms of getting introductions. We're going to focus primarily on those members of the Bacteria Implementation Group, with the goal of trying to certify our quorum. We do have to meet 17 members present, or their alternates present, to certify quorum. And so I will go through the roster list to make sure that we meet quorum today. After that, we will be, if we do make quorum, we will review and approve changes to the BIG roster. We will review and approve minutes from our previous meeting in the spring. There is a public comment period, which I will introduce. At that time, I encourage folks that aren't members of the BIG or alternates to the BIG, if you have a comment you'd like to make to the BIG, to proceed at that time to make it. And again, I will bring that up when we get to that point. We have 5 essential items on our agenda. We'll be looking at the implementation plan update, where we're at with the update to our bacteria reduction plan. We'll review that process and where we're going forward. Item 2 is the 2021 annual report. We'll talk about where that report is in context to be completed and what the next steps are for that. We'll have an update to total maximum daily loads, or TMDL, projects within the BIG project area, as well as for those TMDL projects that are in the H-GAC region, of which H-GAC is a part of, just to give you an update on those. Finally, we'll have implementation project presentations this year, or this meeting. We're going to focus on watershed protection plans, kind of spotlight that for the group, and have a couple of folks from H-GAC presenting that. And then we'll have other business if we have time. We typically introduce meetings or events that are related or are closely related to bacteria implementation, things that our member organizations are doing. But if you're in the group in this meeting and you have a meeting coming up and you want to introduce it at that time, we'll make an open call for that. And then we'll adjourn, hopefully around 3 o'clock. I want to give members of the BIG an opportunity to make any changes they like to this agenda. Please speak up now.
Stephen, I don't see any hands raised and there's nothing in the chat. Linda, she said her microphone's acting up, so I will post the phone information for you.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so we're going to proceed to certify quorum. So I'm going to read down the list of our members of the BIG, and then if necessary, go into alternates. First up, and let me bring that up so everybody can see it. I did send out the roster agenda and the summary of our last meeting to the group. So hopefully folks have had a chance to review that. Items on this roster that are highlighted in green, those are members that are roster changes that will be taking place after we've gone through a review of folks who are on the call today. Up first, Ernest Bales. Ralph Calvino. Jerry Caravitas.
Present.
Thank you, Jerry. Richard Chapin. Danielle Ciosi.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Danielle. Charlotte Cisneros.
Present.
Thank you, Charlotte. Christine Cooper.
I'm here.
Hi, Christine. Tom Douglas.
I'm here.
Hi, Tom. T. Karras. Andrew Isbell. Carol Labreche.
Here. Good morning.
Hi, Carol. Michael Lee. I saw Thomas Samples on. Hi, Tom. Mac Martin. Kathy McCoy. Scott Nichols. Becky Olive. And I saw Karen Kotke is present.
Hi, Steve. I'm here. This is Becky.
Oh, hi,
I couldn't
Becky.
get unmuted. Hi.
Mitchell Page. Linda Pahacek.
I'm here. Hi, Becky.
Hi, Linda. Tina Peterson.
I am here.
Hi, Tina. Sonia Phillip.
I am here.
Hi, Sonia. Rachel Powers.
I'm here.
Hi, Rachel. Patrick Reitmeyer.
Present.
Hi, Patrick. And Jim Robertson is out. Steve Hupp.
Here.
Hi, Steve. Scott Sanger. And I saw Linda Sheed is present. Brian Shemesky. Shane Simpson.
I'm here.
Hi, Shane. Robert Snoza.
Hey, Stephen. Robert here.
Hi, Robert. Lee Tarrant. Michael Thornhill.
Here.
And Scott Tuma.
Sorry, Steve, I'm here.
Okay, hi, Scott. I count at least 21. I don't need to proceed through the alternates. Zoom keeps track of those that are in attendance, so I will make sure everybody is reflected in attendance. But we did make quorum. And we will proceed through the roster changes. As I noted on the roster, there are a couple of highlighted folks. Colleen Gilbert with Greens Bayou Coalition is being suggested for conservation. I don't know if I didn't see if Colleen was on. If Colleen, if you're on,
I am here.
Hi, Colleen. I'd be happy to have you introduce yourself to the big and talk a little bit about Greens Bayou Coalition.
Hi, I'm here. I'm Colleen Gilbert. I have been the executive director of the Greens Bayou Coalition now for a little over a year. And Greens Bayou Coalition represents obviously Greens Bayou, which runs from the northwest area of Houston all the way down to the Port of Houston. And what we do is advocate for parks and trails and flood mitigation and quality of life along the bayou. And we bring people together and we look for grant funding for parks and trails and flood mitigation, obviously. And we do our best to clean up the bayou and make it a good place to live and work and play.
Great, thank you, Colleen. And then Joanna Wilson, Business and Industry with the Gulf Coast Authority, will be taking over for Denise Ehrlich, who has moved on up in the authority. Joanne, if you're here, you're welcome to introduce yourself and talk about what you do.
Hi, yes, I just started with Gulf Coast about a month ago. And as you stated, I took over Denise's position. So I'm the Senior Compliance Coordinator, handling all of the water side. So I'm happy to be here.
We are a laid-back group, so welcome aboard. And then we'll proceed. Let's go ahead and look at the alternates. Brittany Flowers is the new Executive Director for the Biopreservation Association. I don't know if Brittany, you're online, if you want to talk about yourself. And then Liz Stone for Business and Industry is being put forward for Jones and Carter as an alternate. And Liz, you're welcome to say something about yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Liz Stone with Jones and Carter. Primarily with Jones and Carter, I assist with the permitting division. And I'm just going to be helping out Scott Saringer. He does plan to attend this meeting. I know he's probably just going to be maybe about 30 minutes late or so. Thank you.
Thank you. Voting in the negative, where if you were adverse to the motion to approve this slate of changes, you would be the one to voice that concern. And in this case, we're actually going to do a poll. We're going to try a poll this time. So we do need to introduce a motion to approve the slate as is. Before I do that, do I want to make a shout out to anybody that wants to make any change to their roster at this time before we do that?
This is Rachel. I'd like to motion to approve the roster as proposed.
And in a second.
Tom Douglas, I second that motion.
And any discussion? Not hearing any, we'll have our first poll today. All right, looks like we are at quorum for members and alternates. We can close the poll. And it looks like the motion carries. All right, thank you all for participating. Moving to the next item on our agenda, review and approval of the minutes. Again, I've shared with you yesterday the summary minutes for the May 25th meeting. Do want to point out I did receive a comment to make a change to a couple of the items that were under the implementation project presentations. I had left in the will present from the agenda for last from the meeting, and so I've changed those to past tense to reflect the current past tense nature of the minutes. So I'll give you a chance to make comment to the agenda or to the summary. I'll give you one more minute to make any changes you would like to see to the summary minutes before entertaining a motion. Okay, I entertain a motion to approve the minutes as written.
This is Becky. I move that we accept the minutes as written and modified per your discussion.
And a second.
This is Colleen. I second the motion.
And any discussion? Right, Andrew, can we have the poll? All right, I think we are there, Andrea. The poll. Motion carries. The minutes have been approved. All right, we are now at the point where we will entertain public comment. If you are a member of the public or someone who is in the audience who has a stake in the actor implementation group and how it's formed and how it acts and implements the implementation plan, we entertain your comment at this time. Just ask that you introduce yourself and if you're with an organization, who you're with. All right, not hearing any comments or desire to present a comment, we will shift to item 1. So the I-Plan update. For those not familiar, we, and I say we for the ubiquitous we for the Bacteria Implementation Group, there's been an implementation plan since January of 2013. That was when the plan was approved by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality as the reduction plan for the Bacteria Implementation Group's project area. So we've been implementing for about 8 years. In 2023, we will be at the 10-year mark. And so it's a good time to entertain an idea of updating the implementation plan, revising it to reflect things that we've learned, things that are in the implementation plan that are likely not to be carried out, and so maybe alter that to hopefully encourage or address those items that aren't currently being carried out and so forth. As the Bacteria Implementation Groups entertained this idea of updates or revision, it was decided that the plan would be updated in the terms that essentially the document itself wouldn't change very much, but rather reflect things that have changed, as opposed to starting essentially from scratch and creating a new implementation plan. So that's how we have been proceeding going forward. So what does the implementation plan format look like? Again, essentially it's the same. It'll have the same number of strategies that we currently have in the implementation plan of 11 strategies. There's a strategy summary. So each strategy will have a summary of the topic area. And then there'll be activities underneath that strategy summary. Within the summary itself, things that are changing would be new data that's available for us to look at that reflect on that topic area, maybe changes in the references if things we know are new, if there's some new research that's been done, to try to update that type of information in the summaries of each strategy area. When we hit the activities, so these activities are the actual things that we're going to be carrying out for implementation, the types of best practices that we would encourage members of the BIG and those folks that fall within the BIG project area to carry out voluntarily for the most part. We've adjusted it slightly, and so there's an action, essentially a sentence or two describing what we'd like to accomplish, a background that encapsulates primarily everything that was in the original implementation plan. Of course, some wording changes slightly within each of those areas to reflect that, and then try to carry forward that 9-element table to look at specifically the types of metrics that we would measure, how we're doing, what are we going to look at, and then milestones, sort of what's the time frame for carrying out that activity, and then monitoring, looking at those programmatic and environmental monitoring that's used to verify if we're having any success. And so that's kind of been brought forward in a little bit of change. That being said, we're at the draft plan stage for this process, and so any of this can change as we go into the review portion of this effort. So again, we're updating the data. We have updated the data. We talked about that in our spring meeting, some of the challenges that we encountered in that effort to update a lot of our data. And so I think we've gotten past that. And so we're at the point where we're getting this document ready to be reviewed by members of the BIG. I'm going to walk through these strategies really quick. I'm not going to read all the different activities that are on here, but essentially, again, with some slight wording changes, for the most part, each of these activities is going to stay the same. We didn't add anything here for the wastewater treatment facilities. Again, we may have adjusted the language a little bit in a couple of these areas where maybe it was heavily focused on an organization, and that organization is not going to be making any effort, is not implementing And so we changed it to reflect more like what we can accomplish. And so some of it's changed to tracking in cases where we've actually completed it. Say, for instance, the bacterial limits, all the permits for wastewater have likely gone through that have changed to the lower permit limit for this project area. Again, half of 126 down to 63. And so we feel like at this point in time, we're really just going to be watching and tracking that number. And so things like that will happen here. But again, we haven't really pulled any activity out. I just kind of maybe adjusted the language a little bit for each of these. I mentioned data. So as we've addressed it, we've altered some of the data in terms of to reflect current conditions, such as centralized wastewater covering roughly 64% of our project area, or about 290,000 acres. Again, it helps reflect on what the focus of this strategy is, and those municipal utility districts and municipalities that have wastewater, where we want to focus some of our efforts in this strategy. Looking at, and most of you have seen discharge monitoring reports, that self-reporting data from the various permittees out there in terms of compliance. Again, we didn't have this data when we first put the implementation plan together. And so we're going to reflect that here in this revised updated plan to note where new thinking can be found in terms of this thing. So we have more bacteria that's been assessed by our utilities. And again, our original thought back when we were putting the implementation plan together was concerns that the plants were going to have a difficult time meeting the permit limits. And based on their self-reporting data and then some other data that we have that can kind of back that up, we're seeing close to that 90%, upper 90% in terms of compliance success there. And so that's something that we've learned since the beginning. Looking at the size of the plants, back in 2013, that category 0.1 or less million gallons per day took up about 43% of most of the plants. It's obviously come down to about 25%, and it's been spread out amongst the other categories. And so it's just something that's an update for us when we look at this. Permitted flow, again, we know where the outfalls are. We know what the permits say in terms of what they're permitted for. And just to, again, not that there's much that you can pull out other than the larger cities, larger populations, more centralized wastewater have higher flows. And so, the city of Houston, Conroe, Woodlands, down to the League City area, larger plants. We still obviously a lot of utility districts, some of the smaller plants, those areas of growth. And so just to, again, when we look at this information, we can plot it and have it available for use. Looking at exceedances, those exceedances. Yes, go ahead.
We have a question in the chat. Are those wastewater treatment facility compliance rate changes statistically significant?
Well, that's certainly a good question. I'll have a table when we start talking about the annual report. I believe I have a table in there that looks at the numbers over time. In the table that we had, I think we looked at numbers over time. Again, I don't know if you consider them significant or not. We don't have anything to go back past 2012 to really look at. Certainly, we've seen improvement from 2012's reporting. And a lot of the plants were new at that stage. And maybe that's part of the reason why compliance got better over time. But we haven't, the short answer is we didn't look at it from a statistically significant point. We certainly potentially could look at that, see if there's a, between 2012 and 2019, if that change is significant or not. I'll note that, Rachel. Thank you. So we can also pull exceedances from the EPA. The EPA's database as available to look at, and can look at where we have plants that maybe over a long period of time had some challenges meeting their permit limits or some other concerns. And so use this not necessarily to point out a particular plant or operation, but rather if we are looking at and most of the activities and actions within the strategy is technical assistance, providing technical assistance, working with trade associations and others to ensure that we're reaching the appropriate groups. And so one of the goals could be focusing on those and ensuring that we're inviting those plants that maybe are having some challenges meeting their compliance. And so using those tools available to us to be able to do that. So we'll be doing that going forward.
Okay, Stephen, this is Linda Pahachek.
Hi, Linda.
Hi. Did you happen to look at the exceedances and break them down into small plants like package plants and then medium and large?
Well, yes, that's something that's easily teased out because we have, this is the outfalls. Essentially, it follows the same.
Yeah.
So we can do that certainly. If you look at, like for instance, this plant right here, where that's targeted, is again this larger one. So.
Well, I see the exceedances are actually high in the watershed, right?
Yeah, it's certainly spread out more than size of the plant. So if you got your size, these larger size plants here in the city of Houston area, and a lot of the smaller ones here, when you look at those exceedings, it doesn't follow that pattern. It's certainly spread out more.
Right. I'm just thinking, I mean, if the plants are in the upper watershed, or if there's like a grouping where more exceedances are found, maybe that could help us target what we discuss and offer. Of course, if it's package plants, there's not much we can do because there's really been no political will to do anything about regionalization.
I think, certainly in these areas, we have a map for where development's going. I know TCQ's tried to address it with some of the requirements based on how close you are to another plant, and certainly making sure, or at least hoping that when those permit requests come in, that they've evaluated whether they should, connect or not. So I know there's been some changes on the regulatory side.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly this area that you're talking about is growing. So it's going to continue to expand out with the smaller package plants and muds going forward. Certainly be mindful of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Following up, Tom Douglas, following up on Linda's question. Linda, was there a specific table or map that you were suggesting should be included?
Well, actually, I was just asking if they had looked at it that way. I think because I see a lot of tan spots and they're in the upper part of the watershed. So what are the characteristics of those plants that are creating that large percentage of exceedances? I've been on record as being concerned about these package plants that were built as a temporary means back in the 60s and 70s. And they're not really, some of them really don't have permanent staff. There may be somebody who stops by, but they're small. Although they're probably going to get bigger with all the people moving in. So anyway, I just wondered if there was analysis to see if there was some subsets of plants that seem to be having the most exceedances, and if it was related to size or where it was located, type of plant, package plant.
We certainly have that data to pull that together. It's just a matter of pulling those two different, everything together to look at it. And make that analysis. So that's something that we can jot down for our next wastewater treatment facility meeting to do. And that's one thing that I'm always hopeful when we present the stuff is that we have a better sense of where you'd like to go with the data. as we look at addressing where we target information and workshops and technical assistance and stuff like that. So good comments. So here's an example for the enhanced wastewater treatment facility compliance. Again, the metric or the data that we use to assess where we're at. Discharge monitoring reports, or DMR. And we have a back system, Harris County pollution control compliance data. Harris County has been willing to share with us their efforts when they go out and do their compliance efforts with their wastewater treatment facilities in Harris County. And so we've been able to look at both of those data sets together. So that's what falls under metrics. And again, for milestones, those things that we want to accomplish over a certain amount of time, work with the trade associations, use the data that we have available to help us identify the target wastewater treatment facilities, and then offer technical training and workshops. Again, most of the trade associations offer some technical presentations at their meetings. H-GAC, we typically try once a year to have a workshop targeting wastewater treatment facility subject matter. Likewise, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and even the extension service, engineering extension service with A&M, offer some of the stuff. And so encouraging that at least at minimum once a year, that something happens, and then tracking that in our programmatic measures, ensuring that happens. So when you get down to monitoring, there's programmatic elements in terms of outreach opportunities, and then the environmental goals, using our Clean Rivers program, CRP analysis, as well as any change to assessment units to see if on the environmental side things are changing. And so you're going to see that in each of the activities and actions that there are metrics, milestones, and monitoring. So these are all new. When you start reviewing the revised plan, pay some attention here. There's some things that we can change or alter, or you feel, hey, this is too low of a measure. We should be trying to do something more. Bear that in mind. So, that's one of the changes in format you'll see. We're going to shift to, again, these other activities. Again, I'm going to go through these pretty quick. I won't read off all of these unless I see something that is definitely changed. Like for instance, 2.2, we've added wipes as part of it. Again, in 2013, when we were doing this, wipes really hadn't hit the fan, so to speak. And so we've added wipes in here to address that within our implementation activities.
Stephen, we have a question in the chat. Another factor to consider in the analysis of what plants have the most exceedances might be who or what the responsibility for the plant, such as is it a municipality or a MUD? And again, it might help target the approach.
It does, and one of the challenges we face when it's a MUD is we're oftentimes working with a lawyer or a legal firm because that's the front facing of the MUD. And when we've invited folks and tried to get operators and the like to come to workshops, we've often sent out or we've requested information from, it typically has gone to those lawyer firms just because that's the address that we have easy access for. That being said, I think we're trying to make some inroads with some of the trade associations, professional associations, because that's probably a better way for us to get the word out. And we've had some luck going forward that way. And so I think we're going to try to address this topic area more from that side of things going forward.
One more comment in the chat is, or perhaps the size of the exceeding loads coming from each WWTF.
So we have looked at exceedances from the size of plants before. I can't remember if I've got one in the iPlan update part that we, if I put that table in there, but we do have tables that look at it. Traditionally, we have seen from the very smaller ones, typically have more exceedances than the large ones, but again, it's a generality. But hopefully if I put that table in, I can't remember if we did or not, but if we did, we'll get to that. Sanitary sewer overflow occurrences, again, something that we didn't really have a lot of information back when the I-plan was developed, was SSOs. We have more information on that now. As most folks have been familiar with, in areas where we have older infrastructure's been in the ground a lot longer, we find that we have more SSOs at that point. And so we typically, as we move out into newer developed areas, newer infrastructure, don't see the number of SSOs out that way. Some of it could be underreporting. Some of it could be just, again, the newness of the situation. And so bearing in mind that as we go forward into the next 10 years, watching to see if that changes, if we start seeing more out into the newer developed areas, and see if that increases that way. Hopefully and linkage from this activity area to the phase 2 permits, in phase 1 permit for those in Harris County, City of Houston, if things are working as they should in terms of identifying and correcting some of these situations, maybe that won't be the case going forward. And so that's the hopeful point as we talk about sanitary sewer overflows. For on-site sewage facilities, an area where we have had a lot of work, but we still have a lot of OSSFs out there that may need to be addressed. And so, again, these activities haven't changed in terms of the 3 activities and strategies to address on-site sewage facilities and those that are failing. You've seen this before. We know essentially know where most permitted on-site sewage facilities are located, and can map those. About 50,000 permitted OSSFs that are in our project area. We do have some shortfalls. I've mentioned it before. We don't know in San Jacinto County or Grimes County. We're planning this year. I think we're going to be able to get to it this year to look at 911 addresses and try to figure out if they're in a centralized service area, or if they're not, and if they're not, then assign them a on-site sewage facility. So we don't know that. There's also some on-site sewage facilities, septic systems that are out there that may not be registered with an authorized agent. And we're hazarding it based on our estimates of about another 100,000 that are out there. So pretty much double the permitted number that are out there. So if you look at those numbers together, some estimate error failure rates of 12 to 19%, you're looking at a $10,000 average, about 300 million to repair or replace a lot of those. And so it's certainly a number that we still have a long way to go. Stormwater, again, nothing's really changed too much here. Tracking the number of MS4s, phase 2s, continue to try to do that, offer workshops and the like, encourage low impact development, green infrastructure, and other stormwater best practices. Those kinds of things are found here. If we look at the way TCEQ evaluates for their total maximum daily loads, they look at census designated place, urbanized area, and based on the urbanized area from 2010, we have about 900,000 acres that are under a phase 2 permit. Again, phase 2 permits require entities to address stormwater and also address water that comes off of their property and goes into an impaired water to address that water quality going into those impaired waters. And so it's important for us to know where they're located, what entities potentially have a phase 2 permit, and to try to encourage efforts to address the permit. If we look at it from the standpoint of the phase 1s too, that number probably jumps up closer to that area that was under centralized wastewater of about 60% or more. Of course, all of Harris County would be included under that phase 1, so certainly a lot larger area. Additionally, the 2020 census has just come out, and we're going to be looking at that in terms of how it affects the designated areas, because more of this region is going to be covered under a phase 2 permit going forward. And so there'll probably be some more entities being involved we have approximately 140 individual phase 2 permittees out there. So that number will probably change. And so keeping track of that is something we'll be continuing to do. Modeling practices, both here in the stormwater, but also in the research strategy, looking at where those model practices are, if there's some data available to review to see how they're performing, and to, again, try to encourage more folks, more entities to make use of green infrastructure, low impact development, and other stormwater practices. It's kind of the focus of the big and the focus of the implementation plan. So we'll continue to track that. Moving on to construction, so there was only one activity under construction, compliance and enforcement. Again, it really falls under those phase 2 permits. In most areas, having an effective program, and we often offer workshops to help with that and support others that are doing that as well, and we'll continue to do so. I mentioned a map on the development pressure. We're able to address that through our forecast group and model where future development is going to take place. And again, these are target areas for us in terms of where to approach for future workshops going forward. Certainly in the north and west of Harris County and into Montgomery County, a lot of the development pressure is going, as you're all aware of. Illicit discharge, again, illicit discharge is another part of our plan tied directly with those phase 2 permits in most cases. Your phase 2 permits going to require detection and elimination of illicit discharges, those cross connects and the like with the wastewater treatment stream. So managing stormwater so it doesn't have those cross connects is important. And so we're working with phase 2s again to continue to have technical assistance and workshops to address that. Working to make sure that what regulations and enforcement's available, tools are available, are out there. Additionally, in this section, we've added reduced boater waste. We added Jarbo Bayou a few years back. That watershed empties into Clear Lake, as well as Armand Bayou empties into Clear Lake. And so being connected tidally with Clear Lake, which is a place for boaters, trying to reduce waste from boaters reaching the water is certainly something that we're interested in at this point. And so working with the Galveston Bay Foundation on their programs, encourage and what ways that we can support them is part of our practice or implementation plan. So we've added them into the implementation plan. Agricultural and animal sources, again, looking at livestock and nutrient reduction and erosion controls. That activity is still in there in our document. We've bumped it up and beefed it up in relation to silviculture. So we've added the programs related to silviculture, Texas Forest Service, and encouraged them. We got word from them, included that in our document as well. And again, really 7 is supporting those programs, those resource agencies that are already doing the work, encouraging them to bring workshops to our area, which we do. And so that's all that's really changed in this section. Adding land cover, looking at land cover from the standpoint of 2013 to now, forest and shrub covers 25% currently, about pasture grasslands, about 18% of our watershed, cultivated crops, about 1%, and then wetlands, about 8% of our watershed. Changes since the 2011 when we first did this, sort of a loss of about 3% of forest and shrubs, also about 1% of the pasture and grasslands. Cultivated crops has seen a drop of 2%, and wetlands have dropped of about 1%. Most of that has gone to development in the low categories, so low density development, and then about 11%, and then 2% for medium density development. When we look at those land cover types, forested, pasture, cultivated wetlands, and then add in developed low and developed open space, we get roughly about 36,000 head of hogs, feral hogs, that could potentially be in our watershed, just looking at the numbers. Residential, didn't really do much change here. Again, our implementation plan is really to be in support of many nonprofits that are already out there doing a lot of this work, along with the phase 2 and phase 1 cities who are working with their residents on understanding fat, soils, and grease, and a lot of the other water quality issues and concerns. And so really this activity is to track and monitor and to see where we can best help those efforts. Monitoring and I-plan revision, talked about it already, about the I-plan and modifying the I-plan as part of this effort, assessing results in terms of our annual reports. So none of these really have changed, continue to be a major part of our efforts, just to track how water quality is improving in our region or not improving in our region. The 9.2 done a lot with regards to targeted non-ambient monitoring in terms of the big and its efforts, and so tracking that as well. We have about 200 plus monitoring stations, if you include the USGS flow stations in our watershed. Certainly a highly monitored system for those that aren't familiar with the Clean Rivers program, and so track, and you'll see that in the metrics. The monitoring that's what we use for a balance of our data. Research group decided really not to change these. Essentially, again, 10.1, evaluating effectiveness of stormwater implementation activities. I mentioned that when we talked about those low impact development, green infrastructure practices, looking for those that have some data so that we can evaluate that. We have a new project that's starting up this fiscal year that's going to be looking at those projects and others to see how effective they are and to be able to report out on that effectiveness. Additionally, we have bacteria persistence and reed growth, as well as appropriate indicators. Those are things that we want to track and see if changes in research are giving us new information on this. And certainly appropriate indicators, the US EPA is driving the studies into looking at alternatives to E. coli and Enterococcus, and so we'll keep abreast of that change to see if that's going to affect us down the line. So far, nothing yet to report out on that, other than that they're still working on it. And then additional research topics, nothing's really changed there. No one's pointed to particular research yet that we should be doing, although I did, I still have to incorporate some suggestions from Tom on that. And then finally, Geographic Priority Framework 11.0. We've been doing a lot of geographic priority with relation to our targeted monitoring using concentration of bacteria with those high assessment units with high concentrations of bacteria, and looking at those assessment units with low and targeting those areas for our targeted monitoring. Additionally, we're going to start bringing in social and economic considerations into this framework so that hopefully as we're looking for areas to do targeted monitoring particularly, but in other efforts as well, to encourage social and economic considerations when carrying out our projects and looking at where we might want to improve water quality to ensure that we're being equal and equitable. So with that, any questions with regards to how we're proceeding so far with implementation plan updates? And we'll get into the timeline next. Okay. So we talked at the coordination and policy work group last week about the timeline and kind of set on this. Hopefully I captured it correctly. Again, today we're reviewing where we're at with the implementation plan update and with the plan going forward in November and December, based on the fact that we have holidays in there and lose about 3 weeks potentially with some of those holiday dates. That we'll use November and December to review. So The process will be to push out the implementation plan update to you all as sections. So I know there are some of you that are going to be reviewing the entire document, and there are others that would prefer to review just the section that you're most familiar with, the area that you're most familiar with. And so we'll have it split up into sections for you to review based on the various strategies, and give you an opportunity. Additionally, you'll have the updated version, but you'll also be included the original content from the original implementation plan to compare against. Again, we're looking for all types of comments to improve the document, to make it a good document. And then, remember, it's a reflection of the big, and so it's not H-GAC's document per se, it's actually the BIG's implementation plan. And so we want it to reflect your thoughts and your feelings for how implementation should go for the next 10 years. Again, we're trying, the ultimate goal is to get that bacteria reduction graph down, and we'll look at that again, as we always look at how it's doing, to get it starting to go down again. So that's our goal. So after the November-December period, we will meet in January with coordination policy to go over the comments. Minor edits, minor changes will certainly be treated as such. But if there's some major topical issue or concern, we'll take it up in the coordination and policy and adjust it accordingly. Just to make sure everybody's aware, when we talk about the coordination and policy, it's a group that we invite all members of the BIG to participate in, along with some additional folks from resource agencies and the like. And so all members are invited to attend those meetings. And so it's hopeful that you'll participate, so that when it comes to actually getting together in February, we can actually vote on the update if we're ready to do it. And again, it's an if. Just want to make sure, again, to keep it. That's our goal. Ultimate goal is to get this addressed as soon as possible. Thoughts on that timeline?
Yeah, Tom, Douglas, you have for November and December review and comment. So when is the next draft? When should we be looking for the next draft that we can review and comment on?
So I'm going to push that out next week. You'll have, again, I'll have all the sections available. I'll send it out through our file share. And so I'll notify the group that it's available and the location to pull it in.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Other comments, questions? All right. Moving into the 2021 annual report. So we are, for those not familiar with the 2021 and the reporting process, we report on the calendar year 2020, things that were implemented in 2020. That being said, we're going to have a focus on 4 success stories. Those success stories include our targeted monitoring projects, those being carried out by the Clean Rivers Program, as well as those carried out by the Bayou Preservation Association. Additionally, the City of Houston's Green Stormwater Infrastructure Incentives Program, Exploration Green, and then finally the Watershed Protection Plans, in which we're going to talk about as our implementation item coming up here today. It was suggested that the annual report start tracking those watershed protection plans. So we're going to highlight them this year, and we'll start tracking them in our annual report each year going forward. 3 big ideas. So far, we still are continuing to support the 3 main themes that we feel most local governments, municipalities, phase 2, and other entities that are out there should consider addressing going forward, things that we think would have a large impact to improve water quality. That is to reduce and eliminate sanitary sewer overflows, address failing on-site sewage facilities or septic systems that are in your jurisdiction. That includes restoring them or repairing them or replacing them. And if in some cases, if they're not working at all, if there's opportunities that can work, centralized, hooking up centralized wastewater. And then finally, reduce peak stormwater runoff using stormwater practices that can do that. So we're just talking about improving water quality through that runoff. Things like lid, low impact development, green infrastructure, and that kind of thing, including that as part of your stormwater management program. Looking at progress, implementation progress, again, 6 activities have been reported as completed. We report on those, and 32 are in progress. And that a lot of times means when they're in progress, it's really tracking. We have those completed activities, but then 5 of those in progress are what we call tracking, just to see if over time there's changes. I mentioned the more stricter limits put on wastewater treatment facilities. So that's kind of completed, but just making sure that we're still seeing that going forward, tracking that over time. Again, 3 of the activities are ahead of schedule and still remain on schedule. And then 24 activities are on schedule. With that, there are, at this point in time, no behind schedule. And we've talked about that going forward, and so it's still the same. As we do this update and get it finally approved, the implementation plan update, it'll update the annual report, and we'll make some changes to the annual report to reflect the change in activities that we are looking at. I mentioned the trend lines. Most of the group has seen this trend line where we have the original as well as the expanded big project area. Again, the typical flattening here since about 2016. We want to figure out what we can do next to lower that and get the graph going down again. And for those not familiar with the graph, just want to account for it. So the standard, again, standard for E. coli is 126 colony forming units per 100 milliliters. The standard for enterococci is 35 colony forming units per 100 milliliters. To get a standard of 1, we obviously divide those by themselves, and then we take the bacteria concentration and divide it by the standard. So we're allowed to put both of those standards again on one graph because we have areas that include both Enterococcus as well as E. coli, use both standards criterion, and so to be able to look at it together. And so that's how this is set up. And the original project area is that area that was brought in 2013 under the first implementation plan. And since that time, we've expanded it, as most of you are aware of. And that's on this other slide. A little more complicated, but again, these 3 areas, Armand Bayou, East and West Fork of San Jacinto River, as well as Jarbo Bayou, are a bit lower than what we were seeing in the original big project area, and so it brought that down a little bit overall. And then the green line is those stations that are outside of the big project area. Again, a lot of those are meeting the standard or better than the standard. So that's where we are at currently. Mentioned this under the updates. Again, number of permittees in the wastewater treatment facilities in our project area, about 690 according to TCEQ. A little bit of difference in terms of the EPA, probably a little bit of lag time in terms of getting new permits to the EPA. So when we pull the data, we get a little bit of a difference typically. Of that, there's a subset that submit discharge monitoring reports. And again, that subset of discharge monitoring reports is a little different than the number of permittees. Not all permittees actually go to build, and also there are new permittees that haven't built yet. And so those plants that aren't online yet aren't providing data or a report to the EPA or TCEQ. Then we have a subset underneath those DMR that are submitting bacteria. Again, they have a permit limit in their permit for bacteria. And so those are, of course, the ones that we're looking for data. Of those 528 that submit bacteria data, it breaks out as about 510 domestic and 18 industrial. So we'll get that in terms of data. Compliance, again, you've seen the previous table with this in terms of for 2020, the compliance over 97.37. And then sanitary sewer overflows for 2019. We had some issues with the data in terms of an unknown cause that's listed a bunch of times. It's one of those challenges working through this data. We're still trying to figure that out. Generally, if you pull out the 790 and look at the rest of the data, it tracks similar to what we've presented in the past in terms of the number of events, typically from blockages, which is usually the largest number of events. If you put roots and rags, debris along fat soil and grease and other causes, those blockages typically are the largest number, along with infiltration. We look at the estimated gallons. Typically, the infiltration is going to be the biggest in terms of the number of gallons that are released through a sanitary sewer overflow. So just in terms of report timeline, and we'll have that out to you all next week for review and comment. Rather than have a separate meeting for coordination policy, we'll meet again in January to review it and then have you all approve or at least get it to the approval process in February. So it's fairly standard in that. Any comments or questions? All right. We'll move on to the next item, TMDL program updates. So looking at updates, I'm going to update you all today. And I'll first start with those TMDLs within the big project area. And then I'll give you a quick, and I mean quick, update to those outside of the project area. Again, they're primarily dealing with bacteria, so related to what we're dealing with. So Mr. Milliken came to us from Texas Institute of Applied Environmental Research at Tarleton State to talk about TMDL on Caney Creek, which is this highlighted, I get the arrow to point to it, this highlighted section here, this watershed, and this assessment unit 101003 was impaired for bacteria. And so they've provided a technical support document to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's TMDL program, and that they're currently reviewing that technical support document. As it goes through the approval process, once approved, it'll get onto the website. And then finally, when it's approved through TCQ, it'll be supported as an addendum to the water quality management plan that goes to the EPA as part and parcel of that update. So that's been completed. Additionally, I'll shift you down to White Oak Creek here. That is assessment unit 1004J01 in the East Fork of the Eastern River. It is also impaired, and that'll be working, as TIER will be working on the technical support document this fiscal year, and we'll have a report to us in May on how that's going. Looking outside, so outside of the big, there are essentially 10 other TMDLs. I'll only talk about the ones that H-GAC is currently working on. So I won't talk about Dickinson. I won't talk about Upper Texas Gulf oyster waters, but focus on these 5. Looking at Cotton Bayou TMDL. So this little watershed here. We have completed the draft technical support document and draft TMDL documents, submitted those to TCQ for review. We'll be working this fiscal year on a implementation plan with the stakeholders there, getting that prepped this fiscal year. Moving down the coast to Caney Creek along the border of Brazoria and Matagorda counties. Caney Creek, we've sent in the TMDL, and it's actually been approved by and adopted by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. We've submitted the draft implementation plan for approval, and it's working its way through management as we speak. Shifting over to Big Creek in the center of Fulton County, we have submitted, much like Cotton Bayou, a draft technical support document and draft TMDL document. We'll be working this fiscal year on the implementation plan, drafting that with the stakeholders there. Oyster Creek, we have a draft implementation plan along with a draft TMDL document and technical support document. We'll be continuing to work with the stakeholders on that implementation plan for getting their support and approval of it. Hopefully getting that into the management review by TCQ later this fall or spring of this fiscal year. Finally, these three watersheds here make up Chocolate Bay. And so Chocolate Bayou, Mustang Bayou, and Halls Bayou will be working on a draft implementation plan for all three watersheds. All three of those watersheds, we submitted a draft TMDL technical support document to TCQ and it's under review. So we'll be finishing up those documents this fiscal year, as well as working on a joint implementation plan covering those three watersheds. And that's a quick update on TMDLs. Any comments or questions on any of those?
Yeah, we have a question in the chat. Oh, you see it? Okay.
Yeah. Will the technical support document for White Oak Creek incorporate data from the recently completed targeting monitoring projects? That's a good question. Let me have another one. I'll mention that. Okay, Jason Leifester's responding that White Oak Creek. Okay, so I'm sorry, Jason, maybe if you want to talk about it, I'm sorry, I thought that was the right one.
Yeah, I don't have the map right in front of me, but it's one up closer to Lake Conroe, just sort of, it's in the east and west Fort San Jacinto watershed. And it's just to the southeast of Lake Conroe, not down where you were pointing, which there's at least 3 White Oak Creeks and bayous around the area that I'm aware of, maybe more.
Oh, okay, I see. Actually, it's right here. It's like near the Storza Creek.
Yes, there.
Okay, so that's a different area. Okay.
And as for any data, I mean, any data that's available in SWCM-IS will be used and looked at in the document, but it's not even underway yet. We're still developing the initial quality assurance documents for that project right now.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, Jason, I didn't quite get, so the one I meant to ask about is the one up by Conroe.
Okay. So what I'm saying, if those data are available through our SWCM-IS database, we'll certainly be looking at them in the technical support document, if that's the case.
Yeah, these targeted monitoring projects typically aren't part of SWCM-IS.
Okay.
Yeah, they're usually special studies. And Todd, you might talk about how CRP is doing with those special studies. I'm not quite familiar with that. If Todd runs on.
Yeah, that those targeted monitorings are not part of SWCM-IS because they're targeted. They're not ambient monitoring.
Okay.
They're done during low flow periods. All the data is certainly available to look at and to kind of understand where large sources of bacteria are coming from. But again, it's not ambient data, so it won't be included in SWCM-IS.
Well, we'd certainly be interested in that data, if nothing else, just to get a better idea of bacteria in the watershed, even if it's not the official data that we're allowed to use in terms of plotting on the low duration curves and things like that.
Yeah, you certainly have access to all of that. We'll make that all available.
Okay, that's great.
And I see a comment from Rachel.
Yeah, it looks like she's delineating between White Oak Creek versus White Oak Bayou. I think it's the series of White Oaks, I think.
Too many of them.
Yeah, again, not White Oak Bayou that was part of the Buffalo and White Oak Bayou project.
Great. Okay, if there's no additional questions or comments, we'll actually shift over to item 4, implementation project presentations. And with that, I'll be actually turning this over to Rachel Wyndham and Justin Bauer, who both specialize in our watershed protection planning efforts. And we'll let them take it away.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Let's see if I can get my screen shared. Everybody see that okay?
Yes.
All right, then we'll go ahead. So I'm Rachel Wyndham. I'm a planner with the Houston-Galveston Area Council, and I'm here today also with Justin Bauer, my colleague, who is a principal planner with the Houston-Galveston Area Council. And we'll be kind of tag teaming today to talk a little bit about some of the watershed protection plans that H-GAC is working on or cooking up for the future. So just going to give you guys a brief introduction. I know this is a really well-educated group, so I won't get too into the weeds on this. We did just kind of want to bring back front of mind what some of the challenges are in terms of water quality and other kind of environmental concerns throughout the region. So for water quality, of course, fecal waste pollution is very pervasive. Low dissolved oxygen can affect aquatic life, and high nutrient concentrations are also really common throughout the region. And some other kind of concerns that pop up a lot when we're talking to our stakeholder groups include trash, sedimentation, flooding. So these issues are not necessarily water quality issues, but may have kind of parallel interests, parallel impacts on water quality. So that just kind of gives you a background on what we're looking at addressing with different watershed-based plans. So on this slide, I just took a little screen grab of some of the plans that H-GAC is working on, whether those be watershed protection plans or TMDLs. So those are all available on our website, and I believe Andrea just helped us out with the proper link in the chat that will take you to this interactive map. So H-GAC, of course, is just one of many entities working with stakeholder groups throughout the region to improve water quality through kind of establishing these plans. So now we'll kind of talk about watershed protection plans and how they compare to TMDLs. So of course, watershed protection plans are non-regulatory and they're more like adaptive management roadmaps. So we want to be sure we write these plans to cover periods of 10 to 15 years. We want to be sure that we bake in enough flexibility in these plans so that down the line at a certain checkpoint, if we look back and see that we might need to kind of refocus our strategies, we have that ability. So that's one great feature of the WPPs. They're database strategies that are ultimately enhanced by local knowledge. So we do a fair amount of data analysis and modeling before we even approach the stakeholder groups to kind of get an idea of what's going on in the watershed. But then ultimately the stakeholder groups kind of confirm or deny, kind of help us truth our data and let us know how close we are to accurately representing what's actually happening in the watershed. So it's a pretty good marriage of that kind of database side combined with the local knowledge from the stakeholders. And like I said, these are plans developed by the stakeholder partnerships. So Houston-Galveston Area Council, in partnership with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, we facilitate these meetings, but ultimately the stakeholders decide what goes in these plans. And then just another kind of call out to remind us why watershed protection plans are different from TMDLs. So final approval for watershed protection plans happens at the United States Environmental Protection Agency level. There's also no direct impact to wastewater permits that results from these plans. Like I said, these are non-regulatory kind of voluntary strategies put together by the stakeholders. And this can also address multiple constituents and local concerns. So where TMDLs are kind of drilled down on one particular pollutant, a lot of times bacteria, these watershed protection plans can be a little bit more versatile and cover a little bit broader range of concerns impacting water quality. So that's all I have, I think, for the introduction. Justin, did you want to add anything to this section before we move on?
No, I think you've covered it pretty well. I think the key takeaway there is just that, when we get to the implementation plan of a TMDL and a WPP, often we're looking at two things that are fairly similar. And I think the question that's come up sometimes is, well, why do we have WPPs in areas where we already have a big TMDL or in the big area? And I think part of it comes down to the granularity. Often where we have WPPs in the same place we have a TMDL, we're looking at a smaller area. Or we're looking at something that's more recent, or as the last bullet here, we're looking at more than just bacteria, and that is usually what it comes down to at WPP, is that we are bringing in considerations of nutrients or dissolved oxygen or other issues, and looking for those multiple benefit solutions. Not that we don't do or can't do that under TMDLI plans. It's just sort of a broader picture of everything that's going on in that water quality for that area.
Great. Do we have any questions before we move on to kind of talking about some of our case studies? Right.
In the chat.
Okay. Hearing none, we'll go ahead and move on. I'm about to turn it over to Justin to talk about some of the plans that he's worked on in the past. But before we get too far into it, we'll be showing you guys kind of our list of partners that we've worked with on these projects before. But I would like for you guys to kind of keep an eye out, kind of look for what you don't see, especially when it comes to our key partner list. I know a lot of these projects, the plans are already written, but it doesn't mean that we're not still interested in expanding our contact list and working with more people. So if you see a potential connection for us to make, go ahead and bring that up. But I'll go ahead and advance the slides as you tell me. So.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Well, we wanted to run through a couple of projects we've been working on to give you a flavor of sort of what's been going on in the region, especially what's been going on in the area that's covered by the BIG. The first project we started working on up in the broader Lake Houston watershed was the West Fork of the San Jacinto River, as well as Lake Creek, its northernmost tributary. So Cypress and Spring dump into this as well. But when we looked at that giant area, we said, that's kind of moving away from the concept of granularity and being able to be specific to certain conditions and communities. So we broke off this chunk with the intent to come back at those later. Obviously, these are important watersheds for more than just the numeric criteria on TCEQ's integrated report. Lake Houston is a drinking water source. These are developing watersheds. This is where people live. This is obviously an area in transition. And so there's other concerns with conservation and where the benefits to economic development are for different areas and equitable consideration in communities. So like it says, this is very much watershed in transition. If anyone's been up around 1488 corridor and Conroe, you know that over the last decade or so, that area has just exploded. So we're seeing the fairly rapid, especially with the Highway 45 corridor kind of coming right up through the middle here. We're seeing the very rapid transition of this watershed, which is much like a lot of the watersheds throughout our region. Those that are not part of the developed urban core, we've just seen that rapid growth halo expansion, over the past couple decades. We completed this project in 2019, so this is don't want to say older. It's still a fairly recent project, but we've had several since then. And like all of our projects, this is iterative. So we learn a little from each WPP and take that over to the next one. So the little things that are maybe different or better from each project. And this was approved by EPA, so this is actively in implementation. And we've started to pick off some of the low-hanging fruit. So we've worked with local folks to do education outreach in the watershed, to do some trainings, to work on the potential to do things like installing new pet waste stations. We put in some applications for additional funding. I think with one of the things with these watershed protection plans is like many of our projects, there's no built-in continuing funding source. So it's it's up to us and our partners to identify where there might be funding and start to put things in place. One of the great things about this area, as well as some of our other projects, is we just have a wealth of partners who are active in this area. The West Fork, a huge amount of conservation work happens there. And so, next slide for me there, Rachel. So you can see just in the key partners, this is just a high level list of key partners, the actual folks who are involved in this project. It's a full, you take the full screen. And like I said, this is a rapidly transitioning area. Repetitive flooding has been a big problem here, as well as Spring and Cypress. And this is pretty much the hallmark for a lot of our current projects. I talked about the iterative process. We started with, hey, we're collecting all the CRP data. What do we do with it? Let's get involved in watershed-based planning. Let's put it to work. Okay, well, how do we take that watershed-based plan and move it to the next step? And that next step is really looking at adjacent spheres of planning. So what else is going on in these areas that we need to know about that affects water quality? And so for West Fork, we really started to bring in folks involved in urban forestry, conservation, and flood management, because a lot of the really big ticket items, the big ticket funding sources that are in and active in the region right now are around flood mitigation. And we said, well, you can't have a water quality conversation without having a water quantity conversation, post 2015 in this region, let alone 2016, 2017, 2019. The repetitive impact of these events and these waterways is real. And the real activity and focus is on water quantity. So for water quality to have a seat at the table is a very important thing. Specifically in this watershed, we, beyond the normal issues that we deal with in all our urban or developing watersheds in the area, we had sort of the added wrinkle of, along with all the sediment coming from development, there's a lot of sand and aggregate mining in the riparian of these waterways. And obviously that, was something that was very much in the public mindset after Harvey, with the impacts downstream on Kingwood and other communities from all the aggregated sediment that had been deposited, and all the large efforts to dredge that since then. So that impacts the water quality, obviously. But there's, again, when you have an area with so much happening, you have a lot of opportunity as well. And so we've been able to coordinate with San Jacinto River Authority and other folks to have a seat at the table for all these large scale flood management efforts, to identify ways we can coordinate that with water quality, to, if nothing else, to understand what the flow regime, what the changes in the waterway will be, over the next period of time as we're evaluating what we're doing under the Watershed Protection Plan. There's a lot of great existing stuff. We've done education with the woodlands. We've worked with City of Conroe on stuff. There's just a lot of great opportunities and a lot of good work that's already being done where we're not looking to reinvent the wheel. And that's one of the things the WPP stress, and this is a good example, is that we're not looking to come in and say, we know the answers, here's what we're going to do, regardless of what you're already doing. The very first step we have in this process, much like the I plans for TMDL, is to identify what's already going on. What is happening in this watershed? What's slated to happen? Where do we have gaps? We're not trying to, redo what's already being done. Often when on the agricultural side of things, we're saying, hey, there's some fantastic programs by NRCS and Soil Board and everybody else. How can we help promote that? How can we get those to new audiences? How can we help make connections? Not how can I, sitting in 3555 Timmins, go tell some agricultural producers how to manage their land better, because that's not going to go over well. And shouldn't, it absolutely shouldn't. We rely on experts as much as we can. One of the things that's been very prominent in this watershed, especially with some of our key partners like Bioland Conservancy and others, is that this is an important water supply, source water watershed. It's also a very important area for conservation. And there's been a big focus on conservation, especially in the riparian areas. And that's been fantastic to see. We love a very active forestry and conservation and community and NGOs active in the watershed, because those goals go hand in hand with water quality. Those areas directly adjacent to the riparian and directly adjacent to the riparian are the last line of defense for really clearing up water before it gets to the waterway. So lots of opportunities. We're actively seeking partners in implementation. Just because these projects are done, as Rachel said, that's just the paperwork. Now we've actually got to get stuff on the ground. Next slide, please. So Cypress Creek was our next step. After we completed West Fork and Lake Creek, the intent was to cover the west side of the Lake Houston Basin as a single whole, because as we got done with these planning efforts, our intent was to say, okay, there's a lot of similarities between these watersheds. Obviously, they're different in their own way and they have their own unique challenges. But when we get to implementation, it makes a lot of sense not to try and do the same thing 3 times, do it for 3 big areas. Knowing that you'll have to customize here, customize there, but take advantage of that economy of scale. Be able to say, hey, I'm not just buying 20 pet waste stations, I'm buying 200 or 2,000, or whatever the case may be, and really get that economy of scale from looking at Spring, Cypress, and West Fork. So very much like West Fork, but a little less so. This is a watershed in transition. It's a little closer to the urban core, so it's a little more developed. So we just completed this project. In fact, I haven't even sent out the executive summary, the final executive summary yet. So spoiler, that'll be coming out ASAP, just approved by EPA recently. So we're actively underway with implementation. We've got reforestation projects going forward this year. We've got a lot of stuff that's being done by our local communities already. We've got great projects like Cypress Creek Greenway underway. So there's just a lot of exciting work. And obviously we have the benefit of some fantastic conservation work out on the Katy Prairie by folks like Katy Prairie Conservancy and some of our key partners. Next slide, please. This was definitely a challenging project for its own way, and part of it is the sheer pace of development. Anybody who's been, west of 6 or 99, in that area knows that The area that used to be prairie last year is, now 3 miles from prairie, or, it's incredible to me how quickly that area has developed with some of the large master plan communities, with Bridgeland and others leading the way. But even as you get out into the remnants of the Katy Prairie, it's just very expansive very quickly. There's a pretty decent need for riparian restoration there. There's, especially as you get into the mid part of the waterway, there is a lot of degraded riparian area. And, there is, again, coming back to that flood management perspective, there is a large degree of impact from repetitive floods. I mean, Cypress was almost, the epicenter for things like the 2015, 2016 floods. Obviously got hit hard in Harvey. This is an area with a lot of repetitive flooding and a very complicated hydrology. And that's definitely, the impact has been there, especially in that riparian area. One of the interesting challenges here is that, unlike some of our other waterways, there's not a lot of traditional municipal governments. Almost all of the service area within the waterway that's not unincorporated county is special districts. So MUDs, there's over 100 districts in that area, which is, it's complicated in terms of figuring out who you need to deal with, but it's been great to have the districts very prominent and active in the process. And that gives you the ability to do things at a small scale or a big scale. So there's a lot of flexibility that comes with it, but that was a little bit of a challenge trying to figure that out. There are a lot of opportunities. As with the West Fork, this is a very densely studied area for flood management. There's a lot of flood management work going on in this watershed and will continue to be. There are a lot of active forestry projects. We've been very excited to work with Texas A&M Forest Service and some of our other partners, local partners, to do some things, to pilot some things for Cypress Creek with urban forestry and replantings, and we look to continue that and expand that. There is still some great opportunity in the legacy agricultural areas to implement some of those proven plans through NRCS and Soil Board and others. But again, a lot of it's going to come down to dealing with pet waste, dealing with some of those big suburban challenges. And we've had a lot of interest from our districts in doing, some of that low hanging fruit, like pet waste stations. So we're looking forward to moving forward and finding some funding for that. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So I think this takes, is finally done with Justin talking. We can get back to Rachel.
No, I'll just take this one, then I'll pass it back for our new projects. So this rounds out kind of our, the west side of the Lake Houston watershed. So like Justin was saying, starting off with that West Fork watershed, moving down to Cypress, and now Springs kind of in the middle of those two to kind of complete the picture. So like he said, it'll be kind of a better draw for bringing in more implementation there if we have that kind of economy of scale like he was talking about earlier. And Spring Creek is really similar to Cypress Creek in that it is also in the middle of a really rapid transition right now from a more developed side of the watershed on the eastern side, close to that I-45 corridor that is now migrating out into some of the more natural areas on the west side of the watershed. So this project was actually started in the middle of last year, 2020, and we're hoping to complete it later this year. We've already drafted the WPP, but it's currently with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality for some last minute reviews before it goes on to the EPA for final approval. So in this Watershed Protection Plan project, we're still kind of in the planning phases in terms of implementation. So let's talk now about kind of who we're working with, what some of our challenges are, some of the opportunities. So again, kind of sound like a broken record talking about Cypress Creek earlier, with this development expanding west, at least there the opportunity in response to that challenge is that we kind of we have the opportunity now to plan for water quality in the future and how that's going to interact with stormwater management in these new development spaces. So that's one kind of plus to be associated with that challenge. And we've also, throughout this project, really come to the conclusion that pet waste is a real big driver of fecal waste pollution in this watershed. But luckily, as with Cypress Creek, as with West Fork, we have a really active community that's really invested in kind of prioritizing these strategies for improving water quality, particularly when it comes to pet waste. We have a really great relationship with the Woodlands Township, kind of helping us to carry that baton forward. In this particular watershed, we've noted there are a lot of aging or failing on-site sewage facilities kind of concentrated in the Tomball area. But this again kind of gives us a heading. It tells us where to focus our remediation efforts in relation to that challenge. Houston-Galveston Area Council does a lot of work with the SEP program. So it's possible that in the future, if we have access to those SEP funds, we can direct them to some of these target areas. We've also shown that we're going to need quite a few agricultural plans in this watershed in terms of implementing some of our water quality improvement strategies related to agricultural impacts. But again, this is kind of a great relationship, or a happy accident maybe, that this is a priority area for the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board. So there's a great likelihood that we'll be able to push out quite a few water quality management plans to kind of mitigate some of these agricultural impacts. And again, sound like a broken record again, but any needs for conservation in this watershed, we know we have a lot of champions that we can count on in terms of conservation groups that are already working hard in this area. And we are lucky in that, especially on the western side of the watershed, there's a high availability of these natural riparian areas that we can target for preservation and work with some of our conservation groups on that. So that's a quick rundown of Spring Creek. And I guess we'll take any questions that anybody has before we talk about some of the new projects that we're in development. All right. Pretty quiet. So I guess we'll go ahead and move on, and I will pass it back to Justin.
Thanks, Rachel. So, like I said, this is an iterative process. We try and learn a bit from each project. And so if you've been involved one in the past, things might look a little different, but most of our core approach is the same. So again, in areas where we're already in a big area or in a TMDL area like the big, one of the first things we do is look at the work that was already done. Look at the big, look at what came out of the original studies, look at where the I-plan is now for that area. And figure out where we can best add value. So for places like, West Fork, Cypress, and Spring, and again, in our current project in Clear Creek, we're looking to say, okay, what would benefit from a closer in look? Is it more focus on identifying sources and trying to find out relative contributions? Is it trying to figure out, very specific areas to prioritize? Is it, hey, we looked at bacteria, but there's just a lot of nutrient issues in Clear Creek. We need to figure that out. So that's one of the first things we do. So we don't go into this wholly in a vacuum. We really are taking what the baton that the big hands off to us and running forward with it and trying to expand that reach out at the same time while we're getting closer to the ground. So obviously Clear Creek is a little bit of a departure from what we've been working on for the last couple of years. We've had, sort of a little more natural waterways. Cypress Creek's a little crazy, but with tributaries and some undeveloped area, Clear Creek watershed is a very developed watershed. So we're looking at everything upstream of Clear Lake. So we're not looking at the Clear Lake, Garmin Bayou systems, but everything upstream. Obviously, until you get almost into Fort Bend County, you've got a pretty densely developed watershed, mostly urban, suburban. Several major transportation corridors go through it. This is, and there's a pretty high level of traditional municipal presence. So I was just actually looking at the wastewater treatment plants for this, and I had to run it again. It's like there's like 20 plants in that watershed. I had like 100 in Cypress. So it's a much different area. Obviously, this brings us back to the coast to get into some of that cool tidal stuff and tidal hydrology. So we'll be dealing with that as well. So we really, because this is such a complicated watershed, I get to go meet with NASA soon, which is really weird. There's just a lot of stuff and a lot of potential partners. We're looking forward to really digging in on the public side. We're doing some of our technical analyses now, but I would expect our public engagement to probably start in early to mid-December in earnest. So if you'd love to, we'd love to have a conversation with you all ahead of time, especially if you're an organization doing work or you live and work in this area. You know, this is our time to mine your knowledge and really make sure that we're scaling this project and focusing this project on what would best impact the local communities. Can I get the next slide, please? So I'll put that call out. You know, we definitely love to have you all involved. Again, the issues with Clear Creek are not too different from everywhere else. You know, we're seeing fecal bacteria as our primary issue, but with a much more widespread set of issues with dissolved oxygen and nutrients as well. So we really will be trying to hammer heavy on that multiple benefit. So shifting gears again to our newest project, which has you know, just initiated. And this is with the East Fork of the San Jacinto River watershed. So again, not the entire eastern part of the Lake Houston Basin, but we intend to, again, to continue to work our way around that Lake Houston watershed because it's so critical to so many people in the region. So we've done the west side, and now we're starting on the East Fork. We've had obviously TMDL work here in slightly more recent years, so we're really excited to branch right off that and move forward without having to completely redo a lot of things. A much different project from a lot of the projects we worked on recently. Probably the least developed of the watersheds that we worked on quite some time, since probably maybe Bastrop Bayou, when we worked on that way back in the day. This is a very, for at least for the moment, undeveloped watershed for much of the reach. We will initiate this probably in 2022 formally. We've started to work with TCQ, obviously, on the background stuff. As with all our projects, anything you can add, we greatly appreciate. These projects are based on stakeholder knowledge when it comes down to it. We do modeling, we do data analysis and collection, but it really is based on what we're hearing from the local stakeholders. That really is the driver. So can I get the next slide, please? Oh, that's all we had on. Okay.
Yeah,
well, let me just say a couple of, you know, we expect, like everything else, expect the primary should be fecal bacteria. We expect nutrients will be interesting. And, you know, one of the things that we're really interested to look at in this watershed is the impact of things like wildlife. You know, there's been some bacteria source tracking work done down in Galveston Bay fairly recently that kind of gave us some defensibility for some of the things that we've been talking about for several years in terms of the extent of wildlife contribution. Even down there, a lot of those, they were looking at tributaries to the bay. A lot of those are fairly developed areas, and we're seeing, you know, 30, 40, 50% wildlife. And obviously that's, you know, under a very specific set of circumstances, you know, the confluence or slightly upstream in those tidal segments and not directly transferable. But here we have the East Fork, which is, it's a pretty rural watershed. It's you know, it's a lot of undeveloped and traditional agricultural rural areas. We'd expect that wildlife component to be pretty high. And that's something we've been working to find a better way to build into our models because we think it's been slightly underrepresented previously. So that'll be a real interesting thing to see as we move forward and what lessons that might have for how we move forward with even bigger projects like the big. So Rachel, back to you.
Oh, all right. Okay, so I guess last call for questions or any comments that you'd like to make, especially on those new projects that are coming up on our radar before we jump into the coordination section. I think I did just see something in the chat.
Yeah, I see something from Linda Sheed saying, I'm wondering how an analysis that high levels of pet waste are a major bacteria source could be supported in a watershed for Spring Creek that's not as heavily populated, urbanized as many of the other urban watersheds in our region. Yeah, you know, that's the good question. And that's, you know, something that we've, you know, I remember I keep harping on it being an iterative process. That's one thing we've really looked at in several of our recent projects. And how do we better model the sources in the watershed? You know, we use a model, not to get too far into the weeds, a model called SELECT that was developed by A&M that is not a very complicated model. So this is, you know, not a very, you know, it's not three-dimensional, you know, hydrology kind of stuff. But it's a model that is aimed at the level of information needed for decision makers to make decisions under a WPP. And, you know, so it really is designed to give a sort of an upper level look at what are the potential sources of the watershed, where are they, is their relative contribution. So we use a combination of things. A lot of it's land cover driven. So there are some estimates, some data that is, so this many feral hogs per mile of this land cover type. That's real easy to compute. We know where the land cover is. We've got that. We can say, okay, this generates this many hogs for this subwatershed, for that subwatershed, et cetera. Pet waste is based on households. And that's why pet waste tends to dominate a lot of these modeling efforts. And that's something we've had a lot of conversations on recently as we've gone through some of those sources where some of them are more developed areas. Even though Spring Creek has a lot of undeveloped areas, it's got a lot of households, as you get down toward the woodlands, and the same for Cypress. You've just got a huge number of households. And if you use even a fairly conservative value. So one of the things we've always done is gone and look, we've got a lot of households. How many are apartments? Should we be using the same assumption for dogs as we use for a full-blown house? And we've tweaked those numbers and usually been fairly conservative on the dog side. We've done things like, we're going to assume 20% of that dog waste never makes it to the stream because 20% of the people are using pet waste bags, or whatever the case is. We've cut back at that number and cut back at the number, but the sheer number of households, even though in those large developing watersheds, means that dog waste is an appreciable amount. I remember when I first joined H-GAC and we were talking about the core Houston area, and someone had done a back of the napkin calculation that I'm sure we've told you a million times. We're talking about how many, it's like 50 some odd dump trucks of pet waste was produced, in the core Houston area every day. That's a huge amount of waste, and dog waste, even though we treat bacteria the same, different amounts of waste can have different concentrations of fecal indicator bacteria, and dog waste tends to be fairly concentrated as compared to cattle or something like that. So dogs, we have a lot of dogs, they produce a lot of waste, and it's fairly concentrated in terms of indicator bacteria, and so that's why it tends to be fairly high. Now, one of the things that was interesting in some of the bacteria source tracking results was that those dog numbers weren't as high, and a lot of that had to do with where it was and what indicator they were looking at the end of those channels. But it does give us just another piece of defensible information to say, okay, we can now tweak those numbers more, or we can, we have a little more defensibility in saying, look, we know those dog numbers are going to be high because that's household driven, and those households are things we know. That's not a if, that's a we know where the households are. That's part of the regional growth demographics and forecasting. The forecasting's obviously looking into the future, but that tracks pretty well. So we know what those dogs are, and our stakeholders confirm those assumptions. So that's one of those that's just kind of a number thing without a whole lot of subjectivity, except for the things we pull back on, except for the things we say, we're going to reduce that number by this, we're going to reduce by this number by pet waste bag usage. So there's always more opportunity to pull that number back. But what I think will be more important is to more accurately reflect, as we get better data and better defensibility, some of those sources that have been too small and have made dog waste, like the dog waste absolute number is probably not going to change for those watersheds. What will change is what its relative contribution is, what the percentage is when you more accurately reflect what's going. So you're making a bigger pie and dogs get a smaller slice of it, even though the number stays the same. And so that's our big challenge for our current, station, especially Clear Creek, which obviously there's a lot of households in Clear Creek, a lot of dogs. How do we more accurately reflect pet contributions? And so we've got some new science, we've got some new data, and so we're going to take that and move forward. But that's essentially the long and, I was going to say long and short, but that was a little more long than short, of how we get at pet waste and kind of the defensibility of the approach.
All right. Any more questions before we move on? All right, we'll go ahead and move on. This is kind of our interactive portion of the meeting. So let me get this engaged again. All right, so in terms of coordinating these watershed protection plan projects with the bacteria implementation group, kind of some of the roles that we see the big stepping into are, of course, supporting our implementation efforts, connecting us with key partners, and sharing the information in these plans with our stakeholders and with your stakeholder groups. But what we'd really like to do with the rest of this meeting is kind of open up some discussion. So this is our kind of open-ended slide. If you feel compelled, we'd love to hear from you. You know, what are your ideas for implementing watershed protection plans, especially under the umbrella of the big? How can the WPP development and implementation align with some of the messages of the big? And are there any other contacts that we should coordinate with? So if you do feel like answering, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. You can raise your hand and we'll call on you. You can use the chat function, or if you don't feel like speaking at this exact moment, you can always catch up with Justin and I after the meeting. We'll show our contact information on the last slide here. It's been a long meeting.
You know, we should point out, Rachel, that you know, there is already coordination going on, sort of, I don't want to say behind the scenes, since everything we do is pretty much on the public stage. But, you know, Stephen and I and Rachel work together on all these things because there is so much that's shared between these types of projects. You know, there's a little difference in focus between the WP and the TMDL, but when it comes right down to it, you know, we're dealing with watershed-based plans that are stakeholder driven. And that aren't tied to large federal, you know, highway funding sources or things like that, where we are going to be the only implementer or, you know, the primary funds pass through. We're really having to cobble together a lot of different efforts and maintain that momentum, just as, you know, Stephen's done a great job with maintaining the momentum on the big with all of you, and you're obviously a big piece of that as well. You know, that is the big challenge we have with these watershed protection plan projects. So anything we can do to support the big, or you can do support us, helps us overcome some of those sort of intrinsic issues with moving these from documents on a shelf to stuff that materializes on the ground. And that's, you know, that's really our intent with all this, and the intent of these questions is, you know, we don't want a situation in which we've done a nice, pretty report and had a bunch of meetings with people, but nothing comes of it. You know, that's why we're always so excited. And it has happened in a lot of our projects where stakeholders just get on a wild hair, and, you know, they've got stuff going on while the project's, you know, still in development. We're like, well, we have to change our solutions section because they actually started doing something, and now we need to add that. So we're looking for that kind of thing. We're looking for where we can jump in, where we can bring some of what H-GAC does with facilitation and identifying funds and, you know, coordination, and really hook it into what's going on the local level, and try and maximize everybody's resources.
We did just have a comment in the chat. I apologize for what I'm about to say. Jerry Caraviotis, and it says, it seems that protecting riparian corridors would greatly help with these challenges. Easier said than done.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir, Jerry. You know, that is number one with a gun in terms of, you know, a focus, a specific priority focus area for a lot of our recent plans, and I expect it will be as we work through some of the new ones. You know, Cypress Creek, especially Spring Creek as well. You know, we specifically call out riparian areas, not only just to say, hey, those are important, let's think about them. Here's what we need to do there. And one of the things I've been really excited is that some of the conservation work we've been moving forward with on Cypress Creek and some of the existing work through the precinct and the county has been heavily focused on those riparian areas. So we're going to be doing some plantings along Cypress. You know, we've got great projects like the Greenway that recognize how important that riparian area is to the water quality. You know, unlike some of the more really densely developed areas where we're just getting a lot of the input coming from storm drains instead of sheet flow, where the riparian is still vital, but less of an impact to water quality is in terms of filtration, still an impact for hydrology, obviously. You know, we've got a lot to work with in some of those Lake Houston watersheds. And I think, you know, and I think we're fairly, you know, I don't want to speak for some of our key partners, but, you know, like Bioland Conservancy and Katy Prairie, but I think that's been a pretty consistent message with everyone, is that, you know, all of the habitat's important, but man, that riparian just has so many benefits that it really is pretty key.
We have another comment that I have to confess, this is my fault. You might double check to see whether Audubon has been a key partner in some of these projects, either Houston or Audubon, Texas. And that was just an oversight on my part, not including those in the list. But thank you, Tom, for catching that.
Yeah, and Audubon, you know, we'll definitely take a moment to give a shout out to Audubon. You know, we work with them on various projects, and, you know, obviously I'm a big birder, so they're near and dear to my heart. But I think people don't realize, and so if there's anyone here who hasn't worked with Houston Audubon, I don't think people realize to the extent that they're involved in land conservation, not just little bits and things like this, but I mean, fairly large scale projects. And they are old hands at that, and they do a great job. And they're a partner that we should all be reaching out and talking to. They have a great connection with the community. I go to folks and talk about, water quality and wastewater and OSSF. They get to go and talk about birds, and habitat and really fun things. So they're just a great partner to have, as are, all the other key partners we talked about.
Okay, I know we're running short on time, so we have some poll questions for everybody. So we'll go ahead and jump into those. And we just kind of want to get some background information. So we'll post these poll questions. We'll kind of cap it at a minute or maybe about 80% participation, and we'll go ahead and move on. So this first question is just asking, do you live in, work in, represent any of the watershed areas discussed today? And these answers will be anonymous, but we do have your contact information associated with these. We'll be asking some questions about whether you want to be contacted about some of these different projects. So that'll all be done on the back end. So just wanted to let you know about that. All right, looks like we've got pretty good participation in that first one. We'll go ahead and move on to poll question 2. Which of the watershed areas discussed today is closest to your residence or workplace? And you can select multiple if you would like information about multiple watersheds on this list. It's always fun filling the silence while people vote. All right, you guys are fast. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to question 3.
I need to talk to you guys. Get a list of those folks.
All right. And are you interested in assisting with WPP implementation? We won't tell anybody if you say no.
Correct answer is yes.
All right. Again, really good responses. So we'll go ahead and move on. So this one might need your reading glasses. All right, poll question 4. If yes, if you're interested in helping out with implementation, what focus areas would you be interested in receiving or sharing more information about? So again, this is another select multiple question. If you have multiple lines that you'd like to give us some information on or receive information about. So we have, of course, on-site sewage facilities, wastewater treatment facilities, pet waste management, agriculture and livestock, wildlife and invasive species, outreach and education, trash management, coordinating with stormwater, coordinating funding opportunities, and anything else you might think of, please go ahead and include it in the chat or get in touch with Justin and I after this meeting. Right. Still cruising. I want to give people a chance. This one is the most reading, so it's okay. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the next one then. Oh, keep disengaging. All right, so question 5, are you interested in receiving information about the new watershed planning project on Clear Creek? So we'll give you a good amount of time for this one since we'll be emailing you shortly, I'm sure.
And I'll take a second just to plug there that, obviously we've been talking about the areas that we're currently working on in projects, but H-GAC covers 13 counties, and we're obviously concerned and interested in how we can serve our member governments and our communities and our other organizations, wherever that is. We've got a lot of resources beyond our TMDL and our WPP programs. If you have local concerns, you're not sure where you're fit, you're not one of these watersheds, give us a call. Let us know. Let us walk you through what we have. And just because we're not involved there with the WPP now doesn't mean that, we won't be in the future. Often the areas we get involved in are because we have stakeholders come talk to us and say, here's an issue, here's an area we're concerned about. There's a lot of community interest in this. That makes it a more viable project for us.
All right, and we'll go to this is our last poll question. Are you interested in receiving information about the new watershed planning project on the East Fork San Jacinto River?
And if it's a selling point, you can talk to Rachel instead of me. Now, some of you have probably been in enough meetings with me that a fresh face or a new voice would probably be welcome.
Okay, looking like it's slowing down. All right, well, just in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But as promised, we will go ahead and share our contact information here. I know Andrea's already listed these links in the chat, but if you'd like to look up more information on West Fork, Cypress, or the Spring Creek Watershed Protection Plans, those links are here for you as well. And I guess I just want to thank everybody for their time.
Thank you all very much. We look forward to talking to you soon.
All right, I will quickly transition us over and transition us out. I think did have a couple of poll questions as well. I want to thank Justin and Rachel. I want to really highlight what they're doing because it kind of fills in a lot of our project area. Again, target stakeholders closer to their particular watershed and has an impact, hopefully down the range to improve bacteria and our numbers going forward. And so working hand in hand with them, as Justin mentioned on the backside, but also looking at how we as the big can participate in their efforts. I know a lot of the organizations of the big participate individually, but where can we collectively potentially participate as well? Andrew, I don't know if I'm going to start sharing a couple of those little quick poll questions. Keep this moving. Again, what's Big's role? Tracking progress, coordination and support of outreach and education, technical assistance, signatory or a supporter on grant proposals, all of the above. Again, where you think we should best focus our efforts. I kind of had a feeling it'd be somewhere in that all of the above range. Again, I think just in general, there's an opportunity for us going forward to help support what they're doing, support what we're going to be doing too. So, all right, a couple more seconds. Let's go ahead and share these. And the next one, Andrew. Again, we are doing fill-in, and one of the things when we first put the 2013 implementation plan together, we'd put a 9-element table in there, and that goal was kind of hoping that our implementation plan could kind of serve as a watershed protection plan so that we could find funding for implementation. 319 funding supports non-point sources and collectively funds the watershed protection plan as well as their implementation. And so that was the original intent. So just kind of interested if there's an area in Big that we'd like to see funded. Interesting to see what you thought in terms of these watersheds. All right, we'll wrap that up. And is that, I think that was my question. Is that correct, Andrea?
That is the last poll question we have ready today.
Great. I know we're running out of time. Just wanted to give you a couple questions and we'll look at those and see how we might utilize the questions, both the ones you answered for Rachel and Justin, as well as these last couple. Again, let's keep moving. Real quick, other business upcoming meetings currently that I'm aware of. These are some of the things that I have on my plate. Galveston Bay Foundation, you want to get a quick plug in on San Leon Bay Day at the Bay. You're welcome to.
Yeah, we are really looking forward to getting a couple partners together. This project was actually focused on all kinds of non-point source pollution in the area. We did a survey of residents to see what their concerns were and things that they were seeing and resources that they didn't know how to access. And then I've kind of reached out to different groups, and we're just gonna have a fun day at Topwater, sharing resources and playing games and giving out information. So if you're interested in having a table, let me know. It's not too late. And if you're interested in coming out and hanging out, that's great too. We'd love to see you.
Topwater Grill's got some good fish and shellfish.
And oysters.
Yep. Cleaning the Rivers program, regional monitoring program will be meeting on December 14th. Just shout out for that. And then mark your calendars, May 24th for the next big meeting. If anyone else has an upcoming meeting, feel free to share.
We have a meeting in the chat, and also Linda, she wanted to share her screen to share a flyer because she's having microphone issues. But the Gulf Coast Water Conservation Symposium is being held virtually this Thursday from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. and you can find that link in the chat.
And any others?
Bayou City Waterkeeper is having their Folks and Oysters event next Saturday, the 6th, and they have lots of fun with lawsuits and wastewater treatment overflows, sanitary sewer overflows, and things like that. Just saying, have fun.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And any others before we close the meeting out?
Linda, I don't think that's the screen you mean to share. We're actually seeing your Zoom window, and all of us are seeing. Oops.
Stephen, I think if I can, if Linda's having technical difficulties, I can speak to the item she was going to address. Let's see if she can. There we go.
There
She's
you go.
got it. Yes. So Bayou Preservation is going to be hosting a training November 7th for November 6th. We continue to get the date wrong internally. It's November 6th. And we'd love to have some folks come out and get certified as a volunteer water quality monitor. So please spread the word. So we'd be, thrilled to have some other folks monitoring our various watersheds that we're interested in the big.
Great, thank you. Any others before we move on? All right, well, we'll just finish up real quick and say, hey, we're ready to adjourn. I really appreciate your time today, going over about 8 minutes. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to continuing discussion down the road. You have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.